Welcome to another edition of HSF Conversations. I'm joined with Phillip Morgan. I'm Matt Bracey, and for the next hour or so, we're going to discuss That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. To tell you a bit about my own background with this series, before we jump into conversation, I first read this probably the whole series probably about 20 years ago. I was at the time working my way through as much of C.S. Lewis's writings as I could, and I read it, and I enjoyed some parts better than other parts. But it was one of those things that then I was probably early 20s. It was then that I knew that I wanted to return to the series one day. I knew that there was a lot in there that I wasn't getting, but I did enjoy it. And it was also different from anything that I'd ever read up until that point. I tried reading it again probably about 10 years ago, roughly. And I got through the first two books, and I didn't actually make it to The Hideous Strength because I was busy with work and I was gearing up to think about doing further schooling. And so it just got put on the back burner, and I never got to That Hideous Strength. And I also got bogged down with the second book, Paralandra. So in the Space Trilogy, you have Out of the Silent Planet, you have Paralandra, and then you have That Hideous Strength. And uh, and I got bogged down with Paralandra. Well, this past summer, I've worked my way again through the Space Trilogy, and my experience is something of a reminder that it's good to return to things at various points in your life because you see them differently. And that was certainly my experience with Paralandra. The first time I read it, it was I enjoyed it because I was trying to follow, you're going with the plot, but there's just so much there. The second time I read it, I knew the plot and I just got bogged down with all the conversation. This third time that I read it, I felt like I understood the theological and philosophical questions that are at stake much, much more. And so I just absolutely loved it, which then propelled me to read That Hideous Strength. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. I know that you too are a big fan of the Space Trilogy and of That Hideous Strength. So tell us a little bit about your background with an interest in this series, and then we'll get into it, talk about the characters and the plot and themes and all of that.
So I haven't, if I read them when I was a teenager, I don't remember. It seems like something I would have run across during my reading as a teenager, but I didn't recall ever having read them. And if I did, they didn't stick in my memory. But not as a all-out goal, but kind of slowly over the last 15 years, I've been trying to read the entire Lewis corpus. And, um, and every time I've found something rewarding. Uh, and the Space Trilogy had just never kind of cycled into my orbit, as it were. And so, but a couple years ago, I was able to get them on Audible for a very low price. And so I was listening to them on audiobooks coming into, going back and forth to work. And I was fascinated by them. It hit me at a particularly, probably providential time in my life in some ways. And they just spoke to a lot of the things that I had been concerned about in our modern world. And especially That Hideous Strength. All three of them are great. And we could discuss either of the first two as well. But the third one really resonated with me uh, as we were working our way through the whole COVID response, and also some of my experiences I had in the broader world of academia at the time. Not here at Welch College, but as kind of part of the broader academic university system, public university system. And and so I just found it very refreshing and invigorating, and also um, encouraging, gave me courage to face the things that I was dealing with. So I have loved that book since I've came across it. I've probably listened through it maybe 3 or 4 times now, and so um, I really appreciate it a lot.
I should say, by way of caveat or qualification, that this conversation will assume that you've read the books. So, obviously. So, for those listening, be aware of that. We don't mean to discuss spoilers per se, but just know that we'll be talking about the themes in the book. If you've not read them and you would like to, though, it still may be that you want to listen to this conversation because it may be just the thing that sort of inspires you to go forward.
That might be particularly helpful because it starts out with the faculty meetings of a small university college in England. And unless you've had lots of experiences in faculty meetings, that could seem somewhat dull. And even if you have, it can be somewhat of a slow start, a slow burn. But it's really powerful. And I will say for the book as well, we've talked about this the pace picks up significantly as you go on. So in that way, it kind of reminds me of a Dickens novel in that the first part of the book, oftentimes they're kind of building the house of cards, and then the last half of the book is much more intense as it's kind of unraveling all that.
Big picture, the plots of the first two books are relatively straightforward. And the number of characters in the first two books are relatively small. The first book, you have a plot, and then the philosophical and theological import is really packed into the end of that book. The the second book, you've got philosophical and theological reflection throughout. And the second book, I think the first book is a little more plot based maybe than the second book. The second book, it's almost like a dialogue
Yeah.
that's set loosely around a plot. So it might be something like what you'd read from Plato, which may or may not be something to that would endorse it for you, but it's actually quite compelling.
But also would
Um,
speak to what we know about Lewis as well.
Most
That we'll
certainly,
be drawing from that, yeah.
most certainly. By contrast, this third book, it's much more it's much more there's much more going on, both in terms of plot and in terms of characters than the first two books. There's just a lot more people, and a lot more various stories that you're having to hold on to.
And I think the first two books are addressing issues of the modern age in some ways. But this book is aimed directly at issues of the modern age, and I think in a much more direct way.
I would say the first two are as well, um, but it's just heightened here.
That's right.
It's heightened here because you have the characters of Weston and what's his comrade's name in the first two books? In this book, it's Feverstone.
Yeah.
I just can't, he goes by a different name in
Yeah,
the
I don't
first two
remember
books.
what
I
the
don't
first
recall
two.
what it is. Anyway, they're bringing that modern sensibility with them in those first two books, especially the first one. But it's much more pronounced here because there's just so much more plot and all. Well, let's get into it. What about this book? So you mentioned that you first, perhaps, I guess, worked through it during COVID, that period of time. What about that time period, and what about this book made it click for you?
Well, do you mind if we give like a short synopsis of the book for those who
Sure,
haven't read it real
please.
quick? So, and you could fill in if you like. But for those who haven't read the book, if we were to summarize this is the third in a trilogy. They are connected,
Yeah.
but they are also in some ways a little bit standalone. You could read one without necessarily having the others. But the story in this book is of a, a cosmic battle between good and evil that includes the spirits of the age and the spiritual realm, but is carried out also very much in the day-to-day lives of people in what are oftentimes considered to be mundane activities, but that they also have huge implications. And so the story is a corporation that is tied in with the government and the university systems and is using those things to try to achieve
And the
a
press.
and the press to achieve a utopian future using science administration and organization and bureaucracy to control the world. And so you can see here in the back of at least Lewis's mind is his experience seeing the rise of totalitarianism of the left and the right. And then that is opposed by a small cadre of followers of Ransom, who is in some ways a Christ-like figure.
And his name Ransom is not
So
it's not an accident.
that's right. It's not an accident. He has a wound that is not healed.
It's a wound in his foot,
Yes,
and
that's right.
analogous to the
Yes.
serpent shall snipe at his
That's right.
bite his heel.
Yeah, which that does come from the earlier two books, so it is helpful to have those. Anyway, and so they are working out, battling against one another. Merlin gets drawn in, and English history and English legends get drawn into the story.
And we'll need to talk about why on earth is Merlin here. We'll talk about why that's important thematically.
So
I expect.
Yes, that's the overall narrative is the battle between those and how individuals make their decisions on where they are going to land in that battle, in that cosmic battle.
So the corporation is called Bellbury.
Mhm.
And so those are the bad guys, and the small cadre is at a house called St. Anne's.
Yes.
And so the two sides belong to respective institutions, analogous to say the church and the world. And then there are characters that are decidedly over here with temptations to leave, and decidedly over here with opportunities to leave. But then there are also characters that are in the middle, and in some ways the plot is something of a battle for their own souls. And so you have types of good guys and bad guys, but they're not utterly set in stone types, even though they're types. But then you've also got you and me, ordinary modern people who are trying to make sense of how to navigate all these competing themes and aims.
Yes. All right. So that's kind of the synopsis. For why it resonated with me in particular is Lewis highlights in really wonderful ways and then explores the way in which the modern world is restructuring our concepts of gender and sexuality. He's writing this in the mid 20th century, and it seemed incredibly prescient and still does for today. Talking about the nature of marriage and the nature of society. That's is part of this as well. What is the place of society? But the other thing that really made it resonate for me in 2021, I think is when I first came across this, and then 2022, is that he makes a strong argument that scientism is a form of pagan religion, just like Baal worship. That's not to say that science in and of itself is bad, but when we set it up as a god who can uh, answer all of our problems, or if we can use administration and bureaucracy to alleviate all the problems, that those are false gods and that they will lead to the same ends as all other false gods have. And he shows in really excellent, he has a clear understanding of how big corporations, state mechanisms, the press can all be kind of, when totalitarian systems talk about bringing all those things together and under the same rubric, under the same control, under the same roof, literally, that is a recipe for totalitarianism and oppression and in danger, and it's deeply unchristian. And so that just really hit me strongly during the COVID response, the Biden administration trying to create a ministry of truth. The press is, even without having a ministry of truth, the mainstream press is kind of complete slavish obedience to the Democrat Party or the left wing. All those things just, it very much resonated with the things that we were dealing with and my own sense of how to reckon with those. And I think the other reason that was helpful was it's fundamentally a hopeful book. That all those powers of man can seem very daunting and unassailable in the moment, but the deeper and truer things will not just might win out, will definitely win out. and that oftentimes what seems unassailable is incredibly fragile, and the smallest thing could unsettle the whole and bring it down around its ears. So that's also interesting, considering that he's writing, as I recall, he wrote these books prior to the fall of the Soviet Union. So
Late 30s and early to
yeah,
mid 40s.
so he even sees this coming way ahead of his time. As Rod Dreher would point out in Live Not by Lies, it's the little things that finally kind of topples the Soviet Union.
And there's a passage in late 1 Corinthians 15 where Paul says that that which you do for the Lord is not in vain.
Mm.
Your work in Christ is not in vain. He's previously used the imagery of the seed to talk about the resurrection, but this is a larger motif about not simply our resurrection bodies, but the value of what we do, the small things, the day to day. And, it may be, I mean, Lewis died in 63. It may be that like you in your life, you literally die before, say, the downfall of some big organization. That's bad, but that doesn't mean that just because you didn't see the end of the thing now doesn't mean you won't ever see the end of the thing in light of eternity.
That's right.
And there's a way in which a sovereign God is able well, it's the mystery of the resurrection and the mystery of the seed. The seed has to die if it's going to come back and be something tremendous. And, Paul's argument in 1 Corinthians 15 is that is the way of our bodies, our spiritual bodies, and that's the way of our work, our spiritual work in Christ. And you're making some version of that argument from here. It's very hopeful in the end.
Yeah.
And so in your response, you also mentioned that there was a lot of interaction with gender. And you also mentioned that there was a lot of interaction with, but he was incredibly prescient about various things. These two themes, we could go in a lot of directions with them. I'd like to hit on the gender theme in a moment. For now, what I would say, I want to talk about the prescient piece. Something that struck me as I was reading this. He's writing, this book I think comes out in 45, if I'm not mistaken. Today, we're talking a lot about transhumanism. That theme is totally in this book in 1945. What might it look like to have human consciousness survive beyond, as the villains in this novel would put it, the crude conditions of our material existence, and that it's kind of a cognitive or cerebral thing. The fact that he's thinking about those issues back then is somewhat incredible to me, and yet he is.
Yeah, I think part of it is that the futurists of the fascists party, or the futurists who are kind of part of fascism in the 1930s, in their rise, they're all looking at these things. They're all starting to already think about transhumanism in some way. How can we marry human beings to technology, machines?
Right.
And some of that is the kind of the culmination of the Industrial Revolution and all of the utopian goals and hopes that industrialism would bring, and which we still live with today.
To that extent, therefore, this novel is very much about what it means to be a human being. A human being that enjoys to do the things human beings do. So there are scenes in this book where the good guys, for the bad guys, life is expendable.
Right.
You serve a purpose to an ideological end, and once your role is done, you're snuffed out. But the good guys, they do very human things. They sing together, and they laugh together, and they eat together, and if they're married, they do married things together, and they dance together in an appropriate way. So it's very earthy, fleshly in the good sense, human things. So there's a lot of ways in which this it's about what it means to be human.
That's right. And in relation to creation, because you've brought this up, they're doing all these humanly things, earthly things in the good sense, being good stewards. Part of the contrast as well is that they are lovers and carers of creation and animals and plants, and the wicked engage in animal dissection, but when they're alive, I can't vivisection,
Yes.
which was a big thing going on when Lewis was alive. He'd written about that in another place.
The theme of our proper relationship to the created order is apparent in all three books. And it's very much in this book. And so the bad guys have animals, but they're in zoos, and they're for the purposes of experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
The good guys have animals too, but they're not in zoos. They live among them, um, and they're given honor. And there's a bear named Mr. Bultitude, and
Who plays an important role.
who does play an important role.
I think that is the other part, is the created order also plays a role in the undermining of these schemes of man.
I'm not going to read too much of this quotation. You mentioned that, so I turned to this. I'm not going to read too much of this quotation so I don't give too much plot away, but I'll simply read this sentence. This is Ransom talking. We are now, as we ought to be, between the angels, who are our elder brothers, and the beasts, who are our jesters, our servants, our playfellows. So there's a proper understanding of the order of things,
Mm-hmm.
which is not altogether distinct from the ideal that Tolkien puts forward in his Middle Earth stuff,
Right.
with respect to what is man's place in the order of creation,
Right.
and how do we relate to these various beings.
And that none of the others are simply there for our use.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right. The creatures, the animals, the plants, they're not just there for fulfilling our ends and goals and plans. They have their own purpose and ends and goals that God has bequeathed to them, and we have a duty to reckon with.
You know, one of the things that I've increasingly even thought to, and I'll not trace this theme out too much, but I'll just mention it for what it's worth. I'm increasingly interested in what is the human's proper relationship to animals. On the one hand, it's different than the industrialists. On the other hand, it's different than the sort of environmentalist that wants to flatten everything and not distinguish us from animals.
Right.
You know, I'm aware we sometimes talk about our relationship to the created order, and we seem to think frequently about our relationship to nature. So we think about like trees, the outdoors in some generic, vague sense, or we think about our relationship to culture and society, which comes out of nature. But if we're going to talk about our relationship to the created order, yes, it includes culture and society. Yes, it includes our relationship to trees and nature in the abstract, but it also includes our relationship to animals, specifically animals. You know, whenever Paul in I think Romans 8 talks about creation itself groaning, that's the created order. You know, it, it seems to me that when I hear people mention that, it's nature in some abstract idea.
Mm-hmm.
But when you start to specify it, that has to include animals. It has to include the beast. And
especially if death doesn't enter in until the fall,
right,
the animals as well.
And you know, God has a plan for the animals. When he wanted to judge the world, he saved animals with the ark. Of course, animals show up in prophecies about the future, the lion and the lamb, and yes, there's figurative language here. But it's not, I don't believe it's merely figurative, you know. And anyway, I increasingly give thought to what's the Christian's right relationship to animals specifically. Clearly, obviously, we're not saying that animals don't have a particular purpose. Lambs have the purpose at a certain point in history with a certain nation. Lambs have the purpose of being slaughtered, you know, which is a prefiguring of Christ. And so, of course, we're not saying you can't kill animals for proper ends, but that's a far cry from vivisection.
Right. Yes.
You know, the industrialist ethic.
That's right. And I think Lewis, even the way he represents the followers of Ransom, there's some diversity of thought on that, which is Ransom, who is a representation of Christ, and maybe the ultimate what all human beings were created to be. He's an Adam figure as well. He doesn't eat meat any longer, but he also recognizes that meat eating is a part of life, and so everybody else is eating.
He gets back from Paralandra in the book Paralandra, and his colleague is like, I don't remember if it's exactly this, but basically he says, "Hey, you want some bacon and eggs?" And he's like, "No, you got any fruit?"
Yeah, that's right.
It just doesn't quite satisfy anymore for him. Well, anyway, the other thing you mentioned was gender and sex.
Yes.
So I'll mention something about that theme, and then you can respond to me. In Paralandra, the second book, you have the tempter tempting the Green Lady, who is an Eve type figure on another planet, on Paralandra. And one of the ways he's trying to tempt her, which, by the way, that whole scene, you read Genesis 3 and you read it in like a minute or less than a minute, let those 6 or 7 verses, and you're tempted to think, if you don't stop and think about it, you're tempted to think that the temptation went that quickly. And maybe it did. Or maybe those 6 or 7 verses are a condensing of a period that took a length of time. Or maybe it took place on day 6. I mean, who knows? There's a lot of different ideas about that. But in the context of Paralandra, Lewis invites us to consider the fact that it could have taken a time, perhaps. But he also invites us to consider what that must have been like psychologically. Well, one of the ways that the tempter tempts Eve is the Green Lady is to tempt her with the vanity of being a woman. Just as there's a vanity of being a man, too, in a different way. Um, and then later, there's a discussion that sex and gender are not exactly the same thing, which if you're reading it through the eyes of today, you start to get a little nervous about, uh-oh, where are you going, Lewis? But then he ends up saying the opposite of what people say today. So people want to say today, some people want to say today that sex is biology and it's somewhat fixed or more fixed, but that gender is just fluid and it's your own choosing and all this kind of stuff. And a proper rebuttal to that, response to that says, no, no, gender's irrevocably related to sex. And Lewis believes that. But what he says is he says gender is the deeper truth. So male, being a biological male is a manifestation of a deeper masculine reality. Being a biological female is a manifestation of a deeper reality of femininity. And so gender is incredibly deep. And that theme appears in That Hideous Strength. There's this scene where he says that Malodil, which is also a Christ figure in a different way, that he's more deeply masculine than we could possibly conceive. That he was a man, but underneath that, he's more deeply masculine than we could possibly conceive. And so Lewis is exploring what masculinity looks like over here, and you've got different types of men. But then he's also exploring what femininity looks like over here, and you've got different types of women. So you've got this character, Jane, who's born in the modern world, and she's trying to figure out what does it mean to be a woman. And she thinks that she's a modern, enlightened woman who's not, who's been liberated from the stereotypes of the past. Well, you have another character who represents the stereotypes of the past, Mother Dimble, and then you have, and she's with St. Anne's, but then you have this other woman who is associated with Bellbury, the bad guys, who is she's known as the Fairy. Hardcastle is her last name, and she is this woman who is very masculine, very, very masculine. She's a not that all police women are masculine necessarily, but she's a policewoman. She's severe. She smokes a cigar, basically, or at least carries one in her mouth all the time. She's rough. She's not, she's really, really, really rough around the edges. So you have quite the spectrum
Yeah.
of what femaleness can look like
Hmm.
within the context of this story. And so just as this is a story, well, this is a story about what it means to be human, but as a part of that, it's a story about what it means to be a woman, Jane, and then it's a story about what it means to be a man. And you have that in the character of Mark, who's her husband.
Hmm.
So I really like the way that he explores these various themes out. And then, of course, in the end, a character like Mother Dimble is an ideal toward which women should look. And a character like Dr. Dimble, her husband, and a character like Ransom. These are men
Hmm.
toward whom we should look. Versus characters like the fairy or Major Hardcastle. That's not that's not the kind of woman we want to be.
Yeah.
Because that's where modernity is leading.
Hmm.
And these other characters with Belbury like Wither and Feverstone and Frost, these are not the kind of men
Yeah.
that we want to be like.
Yes, that's right. Um, the kind of because of my studies over the last several years, historians, the modern historian discipline is just rife with radical feminist interpretations. Sexuality and gender is a big part of the interpretations that I've had to deal with at universities, at Middle Tennessee State University and at Kansas State University. And then just my reading. And as I'm trying to prepare my students, I'm trying to help them to understand what the broader interpretations are and how we are to respond to it as Christians. So it's something I've really been trying to wrestle with is how do we understand the nature of sexuality and gender from a biblical worldview? And then how does that influence the way we understand the world and history and all of that? So I found Lewis's engagement with this topic very helpful, very refreshing, um, and it meshed with everything that I had been kind of working my way toward, and really helped me to expand that in some new ways. And I thought that in particular, his men have suffered from the sexual revolution and the attempts to restructure gender. But I don't think men have suffered nearly as badly as women have. And I think they have been particularly the ones who have been under attack. And Lewis, I think, represents it in that way as well. That the central female character, Jane, who is married to Mark, they're a young married couple. They are both academics. They are a modern couple who are actively avoiding having children. And it is Lewis is empathetic to the struggle that particularly Jane is working her way through, but also Mark, who's not being a man. And but he also recognizes that there are cultural and social pressures that are being put on these young people to conform to a modern sensibility or a non-Christian, non-traditional, or just non-real understanding of the world. And then he sets that up against these types. And so I found that very helpful. I love the character of Miss Dimble. She is this older woman who she and her husband is a university professor. She is full of good, solid sense. She is clearly a helpmate to her husband. They're a companion couple. They love one another, but being an old married couple, they also have their little picadillos and squabbles that have carried on for who knows how long. But they're good natured, and she reminded me a lot of the older women that I grew up around in my church and in my community. And they're kind of just uh, deep understanding of the nature of reality,
Hmm.
not articulated in an academic sense, not very oftentimes even very direct in their instruction or their representation of it, but more in a subtle and embodied sense. They represented, well, this is what true femininity is. And in particular, in the book, at one point, Mrs. Dimble is helping. She and a couple of other older ladies are helping to put together a young woman's bridal room. She's getting ready to get married. Her husband has been away, or her fiance. He's getting ready to come back, and so they're kind of arranging the bridal chamber. And there's a deep sense that the community is also involved in marriage. Marriage isn't just one man and one woman, but it's one man and one woman in relationship to the community. But Mrs. Dimble is represented as being very kind of prim and proper. She's a very serious woman about not doing things that are improper. But she also has an earthy sense of what is the nature of the marriage relationship and of the bridal or the marriage night. And she has a bit of she's a little bit more comfortable with that than the modern woman is. The modern woman is very uncomfortable with the discussion of what they're preparing for and all that. And Lewis points out that the modern person would feel very comfortable talking about the mechanics of sex in front of a whole crowd of people, where the traditional person would never do such a thing. But within the proper bound and sphere, they are actually much more comfortable with the realities of what is going on.
And they're talking about it in a real way, not a mechanical way.
That's right. That's right. Talking about it in a real way with all of its kind of foibles and just particularities. Anyway, and it just reminded me of, my sisters and my wife talking about how much they benefited from the older women in our congregation and how they poured into their lives and gave them good counsel, as for my sisters, young ladies growing up, and then for my wife as a young wife and having kids. And she regularly talks about the good instruction she got from older ladies. One example is a widow told Megan, before you go to sleep every night, make sure you just reach over and touch your husband. She goes, because one day he won't be there. And that has just kind of stuck with her, and it's something about the nature of reality and the deeper things that aren't so surface. But so anyway, I love her character. I think she might be my favorite character in the whole book, although there are many great characters. But I think Lewis captures perfectly that sensibility, and it's not flashy. It's not modern. It's not going to be in a magazine or a book, a modern book, but it's what's real. So I love that part of it.
Thinking about an action step from this aspect of this conversation, the easy thing to do and the temptation for all of us is to talk to people who are our age and who are in our worlds. And it's very understandable why that happens. I mean, from an early age, we go to school and we're 6 and we're 7 and we're 8 and we're in there with a lot of 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds. The places in society that force you to interact with people from different generations, there's not a lot of them.
Not anymore. You're right.
Not anymore. There's not a lot of them. Church, but insofar as church is siphoning off people according to age, well, then that's part of the problem.
So now you're down to Thanksgiving meals and Christmas.
Right.
And
right.
Maybe 4th of July.
But even at Christmas and Thanksgiving, we have a table for the kiddos.
Yeah.
And then we have a table for the old folks.
Yeah.
And so we're separating. And, there might be reasons to do that kind of thing once in a while. But one of the downsides to that kind of thing, there's no intergenerational interaction. So it seems to me that one of the things Lewis is implicitly saying through this story, one of the things you're saying is, if we're going to be wise, we need to make it a discipline to force ourselves to interact with people who are in different cultural settings than we are, subcultural settings than we are. So culturally, the way that I'm seeing the world as a 39-year-old, nearly 40, is different than the generationally, perhaps. Generationally, culturally. In other words, we need to spend time with younger people and pour into them. I can say that now that I'm close to 40 and you are. And then we definitely need to spend time with people who are older than us. Like that has to be a discipline. So discipline's a good thing. Discipline, you want to get better at a thing. You practice the discipline of
Mhm.
athletics or,
Right.
whatever it is, the discipline of practicing an instrument, whatever it is. Discipline can seem bad because, excuse me, because it might mean you got a whooping when you were a kid. Um, but fundamentally, discipline's good because it's trying to direct your behavior in a way that's good. So, uh, as someone who's interested in running, doing 400 or 800 repeats, that's very uncomfortable,
Mhm.
but it's good for you. So, spending time with older people, like even the most reasonable Christian people, uh, who is say 25, to spend time with someone who's 65, it's kind of weird. It's kind of strange if you really spend time with them.
Mhm.
And maybe you discover that you're impatient
Mhm.
or that you want to roll your eyes at them or whatever. All that is a mirror of my impatience.
Mhm.
Like if I'm that 25-year-old, all that is a mirror of my impatience, and that's
Right.
my problem. And and me rolling my eyes at them, that is a reflection of my pride. Because I can't, in that way, I'm like Mark or I'm like Jane. I can't possibly conceive, even through a Christian veneer, I can't conceive of how to see the world differently than what I am. But I think it would be helpful for us to all take a step back and have humility and recognize there's a lot of wisdom in what those who have gone before us have. I mean, in
Mm.
some cases, they're just wrong.
Yeah.
Just like in some cases, I'm just wrong. We all have our problems, our
Mhm.
our sins. But some of it, it's not that it's wrong, it's just that it's different. And
Mhm.
it strikes us as strange because we have Christianized something of the spirit of the age, which we actually need to get out of.
Mhm.
But that has been the
Right.
air that we've breathed. So it's somewhat suffocating
Right.
to think about existing and to thinking about things in a different way. But we've got to. But it doesn't come across as flashy. It's
That's right.
it's folksy, not flashy.
Yes. And for older folks as well, as we get older, we grow increasingly tempted to roll our eyes at the young and all of their, you know,
So the educated,
frippery.
the educated young are rolling their eyes at the old, and the older rolling their eyes at the young.
Yeah, and it's easy to do both.
Yeah.
And in our particular age, maybe to do it in both directions at the same time. But there's a recognition that the young also, like you do get vibrancy with youth. You get energy and a willingness to do things that are new and experimental, and those are all good characteristics. And in a healthy church, this is where the church is so beautiful in many ways, is it brings all those together. And the old do give wisdom to everyone, but the young also bring something good to the
Yes.
body. The other thing that I noticed in the book, which I hadn't really thought of until you brought this up, but it's also a picture of the church. I've been struck a lot lately, at least in my small, you know, rural churches that I've been a part of. I don't know if this would apply to a megachurch, although maybe it would. I think that the church is a very unique place in American society where you have people of different classes spending a lot of time together. And just because someone is educated or wealthy doesn't mean they're going to be in control or command of the community, the church. That in fact, you have a much broader mixture of working class folks, folks who come from very complicated and difficult backgrounds, with people who are much more educated or wealthy, and they're all meeting together in the same congregation. In this book, the house of ransom, the house of God, is filled with working class folks who are servants, you know, in
Mm.
other people's homes. In fact, you have the servant of one, she's a servant in somebody's house, and then Jane is also there. So she's there at the same place with the lady who's her servant. And then you have very educated people, you have people who come from a different background altogether. But at Belbury, the place of modernity, everyone is a technician of some sort. They're all educated. There are no lower classes.
Yeah.
And there's no very high classes.
Hmm.
It is just the educated elite that are technocrats.
That reminds me, so he's writing this in 45, or it was published, I think, in 45. It uh, undoubtedly Lewis had seen this kind of thing, and could see where it was going. But it reminds me, was it JFK's administration where he was going to have a government run by experts?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that worked out.
David Halberstam's book, The Best and the Brightest, is about that.
Yeah.
And that, yeah, it worked out very poorly.
It worked out very poorly. Yeah.
But no, but that was the conceit of all, well, and it still is the conceit of our governments today, but certainly the governments of the 30s and 40s were, we have figured out through our modernity, through our technology, if we can organize enough things, we can bring complete order to everything. And in here, he has this wonderful little section where a character who is at Bellbury, and actually the institute, it was called the National Institute of something something, but the acronym was NICE, NICE. And there's again the play in of propaganda. But the NICE, they're going to have a system where they're going to have committees, and all these committees are going to be meeting to meet on specific things, and they're going to have a pneumatic system of messages like you have at the bank where you send it. And whenever they make a decision on one thing, they'll send that to a central location, and all those decisions will be coming in, and they'll be putting it up on the big board, and they're gonna rationalize everything through this pneumatic system, and all these committees working together. And it's just exactly the way that technocrats think. And Lewis says this is the most horrendous and inhuman thing, but also it is completely fallible.
I should mention, Lewis says at the beginning of this book that this story could have happened in any sphere of culture,
Mhm.
but he wrote about it happening in the world of higher education because that was the world he knew about.
That's right. And England.
And England, that's right. That was the world he knew about. But both in the narrative and in what's essentially the preface, he says this could happen in any nation and in any vocation.
Mhm.
I have to say, we don't have to spend too long here, but being in higher education, there were scenes about some of those higher education, those meetings, those at the college, that are just so incredibly true to what your experience is as
Yeah.
someone who's like, yep, yep.
Yeah.
And you've got different people at the university saying different types of things, and you're like, yep, that reminds me of this, or yep, that reminds me of that.
That's right. Yeah, he definitely has a lock on that. And I said that it reminded me of the world of higher education. There are some characters in the education, the college that he's dealing with, who are clearly misrepresenting things. They're using false words that have a particular connotation to try to get something across. And I listened to that book the first time, as I recall, on a trip to a big conference that I was sent to that was dealing with democracy because I oversee our civics education here at Welch, and they had representatives from all the major universities of the Southern Association of Colleges and Universities, and I was there simply kind of as an observer to take part in, but those are exactly the people who were running that, and it was so unnerving how perfectly Lewis had captured these people who, by the way, are bad faith actors and who are actively looking to overthrow the freedoms of America through the university system. Like, that is not a conspiracy theory. I have been in those meetings where I've heard people from major universities in the United States saying, we have got to figure out a way to hide what we're doing through different language because people have figured out that this language means this thing. And they always say, well, we just got to put it better. But what they really mean is we've got to change the language so that they won't see what we're trying to do because they believe that it's the language that's the problem.
They are your typological wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah. And they're, anyway, it's
Well,
not just a conspiracy theory.
There's a lot to talk about that we could talk about. If we had time, we could get into, and I'm going to be very vague here, relatively speaking, but if we had time, we could get into the reenactments of various biblical scenes in this book. There are echoes of there are reenactments of the Tower of Babel. There are reenactments of Pentecost. There are angel-like characters called Eldils who meet with Ransom in an upper room.
Mhm. Yeah.
So there's a reenactment of upper room stuff in the New Testament, and even Pentecost. So it's a lot of the passages. I'll say a lot. Several of the passages are just brimming with with biblical imagery, and I'll leave that there. It's just really good and really rich and really fascinating. But we need to think about wrapping it up. But before we wrap it up, one theme that we have to talk about is Merlin.
Mhm.
So the first time I read it, I'm in my early 20s, and I don't know a lot about, I know a little bit about English history. I don't know a ton about English history. I know next to nothing about Merlin. I have a vague sense that he's this important figure, but I don't know a lot about him. And then you read this and you think to yourself, well, that's weird and random. Why is Merlin here? What does he have to do with anything? By the way, anytime you read something, um, maybe anytime is too strong. Many times that you read things, be it in Lewis, be it in Tolkien, be it in MacDonald, wherever, and we come across it and we just don't understand. I don't understand that image. This seems really weird. It seems really random. They're just making it up as they go along. Probably not. They're probably not just making it up as they go along. There's probably something they're pulling from. Maybe it's from Bible, maybe it's from Socrates, maybe it's or Plato. Maybe it's from they're usually pulling from something. The fact that it seems weird to us or seems random to us really is just it's just exposing, in this case, my own ignorance.
Mhm.
Like the fact that I couldn't, when I read it when I was in my early 20s, couldn't make sense of why Merlin is showing up. What does he have to do with anything?
Yeah.
This is bizarre. The fact that I couldn't make sense of it was just a way of saying I didn't quite get it, you know. This time though, I had a lot more appreciation for what he was doing with his bringing up Merlin. So I think part of what he's doing is related also to something he's doing in Narnia. I'll make that connection in a minute. I'd love to hear your thoughts on why Merlin.
Well, for me, I had never read the Arthurian legends. I'm familiar enough with them. I watched the Disney movie about Arthur, or the cartoon when I was a kid, Sword in the Stone, but I hadn't read them. So that actually inspired me to go back and then read about King Arthur and read some of those stories. Um, I think he brings Merlin in, one, because he's dealing with English history and legend and myth. And so he brings Merlin in because it's part of that. But it's also because it's centered around academia and something I had never really thought of. But when he kind of opened my eyes to this, and then when I was reading the Arthurian legends, I thought, oh, yes, that's Merlin is a medieval academic. He speaks in a foreign language that other people can understand. It's Latin, but it also has a lot of power. He knows things that no one else knows. These people have never been outside. And he becomes the advisors to kings and things of that nature. He sees things that people don't. And I actually took one of the things I loved about this book is in our particular context, and I can understand why, with being my experience with broader academia, is that academia is under attack
Hmm.
from the left and the right. The left wants to make it a creature of ideology and politics, and the right is rejecting that, as they should, but in the process, they're casting out the baby with the bathwater and says, academics is never a good thing. We only need practical things. So, in my sensibilities, I can understand why the right would say that. But I've always felt like they got it a little bit wrong. Lewis makes a rearguard defense for academia and says it is a valuable thing. And that just because it doesn't have a practical, obvious thing like result doesn't mean that it's not important. In fact, it may be extremely important, and that the impractical things have deep importance. And Merlin is the height of that. So he comes back and is serving as kind of this representative. But he's also a symbol of the things that precede, that pre-modern world. A world that was more alive and less dead.
So part of our defense against modernity is, to use a theological phrase, renewal through retrieval, retrieving the pre-modern things, which have power.
Yeah. But it doesn't look like industrial power.
Right.
In fact, he has a very clear contrast. The NICE, they're eugenicists, and they're obsessed with eradicating all life and turning everything into a parking lot. That's the end goal they want. Or the surface of the moon is literally what they're arguing. They want to make the Earth like the surface of the moon. And he says, that's what happened to the moon. The moon used to be very lively, but that world won out and they've killed everything living. Not the pre-modern world. In fact, in the pre-modern world, everything is alive, and Merlin is shocked that Jane and Mark would have artificially, they would have used birth control. He says that's the deepest and most wicked magic of all. And I can't believe that you have allowed this to go on. And so it is, it's an argument, it's a beautiful polemic against eugenics. And I think that's also very wonderful. So Merlin is that representation of pre-modern life, but also knowledge in the academic world in the truest sense, the Christian sense, not in the modern sense, and how they have an important role to play in the beating back the defense against modernity and its technocracy. But that's my take on Merlin. So
I think that's good. I think that's really good. A rearguard defense for education. Methodologically, the way that he's doing that is therefore also by making a rearguard defense for history through the sort of ethic that comes from obedience to the fifth commandment, to honor our forebears, those who have come before us. Which goes back to our previous themes, a theme about the importance of us spending time with older people.
Yeah,
we need to be connected to the past.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, let me be more specific. It's not just education, but more specifically the humanities. Because what he's saying is Dr. Dimble is an English professor. And his whole research has been in the Arthurian legends. And that seems to have no bearable consequence for day-to-day life. It has no practical purpose, it has no practical application. Nobody at the government wants to hear about that from him. But what he's doing actually has more significance than all those other things. It's deeper than that. And so specifically what he's doing is he's making, why I say rearguard defense is, the humanities have been in retreat since the rise of modernity. They have been forced to become more scientific and been under the guise of scientists do the real knowledge. We don't really deal with knowledge.
So, and this manifests ultimately in terms of what today we call STEM.
That's right.
Now, we wouldn't say that there's no use in the STEM subjects.
That's right. And nor does Lewis say that.
Right, nor does Lewis say that. He's not against science, he's against scientism.
Yeah.
But when you elevate STEM above the humanities, and then you treat the humanities as if they're just garbage.
That's right.
And STEM as if, well, they become your deity.
Yeah. So actually the solution is the liberal arts, the classic understanding of education, where you have the humanities and mathematics and all the elements that kind of flow from that balanced together. That you need both in order to be a fully formed human being, a fully liberated human.
Yes. You had said, not in this conversation, but in a different one that we were having, that Dr. Dimble reminds you of, you wonder if you're reading a bit of Lewis in Dr. Dimble.
Yeah.
Because he's this, prof of medieval English literature. I wonder if there's a bit of Lewis in several of these characters.
Right.
So as a young man, maybe Lewis is like Mark.
I think so.
And then eventually he gets to a place where maybe he's like McPhee.
Yeah, that's
You know,
right.
he's a little older, but he's
A
still
skeptic.
a skeptic. He's
Yeah.
quite critical, but he's grown up from Mark.
Right.
And then eventually he makes his way to Dimble. So there's
Yeah.
something of, I mentioned there are different types of men, there are different women, there are different types of men, and that's kind of a path there. You go from say Wither and Frost over
Right.
here to Mark to McPhee to Dimble
Right.
and the director or Ransom. Well, back to Merlin. Yes, this story is about good and evil in the modern world in England, but facing down good and evil, facing down evil um, in England means it's English.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to look to your past. So that's a very important part of the past. I think there though that we also have. So in this way, Merlin is also something of a Christ figure because he's, in a manner of speaking, he's resurrected. So we have that First Corinthians 15 theme,
and he brings judgment
coming up, and he brings judgment with him. But then also, you mentioned the mythological piece. Something that I wonder if what Lewis is doing. So Merlin represents a druid figure who is living in a very, very, very early Christian England.
Mm-hmm.
The influence of Christianity has just gotten there,
Mm-hmm.
but there's still a lot of influence of paganism.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the same way that Tolkien is trying to make a meta story that helps to make sense of all the systems of the world, that tries to put it under the right umbrella. It might be that through Merlin, Lewis is trying to do some version of the same thing.
Yeah.
Because part of their history is the history of having been evangelized.
Mm-hmm.
But you got to look at what you've been evangelized from. And what you would have been evangelized from as an English person. Well, it would have been Anglos or Saxons or maybe the Gauls had worked their way up from France and Germany area. But it would have been some version of paganism. And so that's the thing that's been redeemed. And so in that way, it reminds me, Merlin showing up in this book, it's sort of like Santa Claus showing up in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yes.
You're like, what is Santa doing here?
That's right.
But part of his,
especially if you were raised evangelical where you didn't even believe in Santa. But yeah.
But part of what he's doing is he's trying to say there is a story, the true story, the Christian story, that is able to make sense of all other stories.
Yeah. Those stories, that's right, that they are a glimpse of this deeper, truer story, which Lewis very explicitly says that's a way that we should go back to the pagans, is to go, these had a glimpse of the truth, but the deeper truth comes from Christianity. But when we know the deeper truth, it helps us, those pagan stories can help us to understand the deeper truth a little bit better.
And of course he explores these ideas in Myth Became Fact. He explores these ideas conceptually. Well, there's a lot here, and it's a really good book. And so I appreciate your talking with me about it and us reflecting a bit on it. I was looking at this cover as we were talking, and the cover appears to be a picture. I think it's a picture of the moon, or it's a picture of some land, and there's a mountain range down the middle of it, and on one side it's barren like the moon, and on the other side it's full of trees. And so it's this picture of good versus evil. And it's a question of, what is our earth going to be like? Is it going to be like this barren place on the left, or is it going to be like this forest tree filled place on the right? And it's very compelling.
Even the title has got a double meaning: the hideous strength of man in totalitarian systems, but then the deeper, truer, hideous strength of God in the spiritual realm, and and the judgment that is to come, which will bring all kingdoms and systems to naught. So yeah,
there's a scene, we won't talk about it, but there's a scene where let's just say the Eldils show up, the angel-like creatures show up, and it is utterly sublime. It is terrible. In the true sense of that word. It like these are good beings, but he writes it in a way where it's like, if I was there, that would invoke absolute terror. Like
Mhm.
like Isaiah 6,
Yeah.
like
everyone who meets an angel in
like
the Bible.
everyone in the Bible who meets an angel, they're like, oh man,
Yeah, they all pass out almost.
they
Every last
they
one.
it's serious. And Lewis captures
Yeah.
that well. So it's in the world, but it also trains you to see um, that there's more going on in the world than your eyes recognize if you just have the eyes to see it.
Yeah.
So anyway, well, this has been good. This has been good. I appreciate it. Do you want to say anything as we sign off?
No, that I think we could have done this for another 2 hours and we still would not have got to the bottom of everything that is in there. Um, it's a really delightful book. For me, I keep seeing every character either speaks to some of my own experience as a person, growing and developing and in the modern world, or I go, yeah, I know that person.
Hmm.
I've met that person before, and on both the good and the bad. We talked about Miss Hardcastle, the fairy. Uh,
Which is a really ironic title.
yeah,
She's
it's meant to
hard.
be. That's right.
She's hard, Castle, but she's the fairy.
Yes, and she's very. You said she's very masculine around the edges. She's obscene. She's vulgar, and she's very sexually base as well. Like she's clearly, and I just anyway. Yeah, and all the characters are that way where you just go, "Oh, yeah, I've met that person." And maybe it's because of, the worlds that we've run in. He is dealing with academia to some degree, so we see some of that in especially my experiences in public education, or public universities. But it's a great book, and I think it addresses a lot of the things we're dealing with today. The abortion issue is there, the birth control issue is there. What are we going to do? How do we shape our marriages in the modern world? What is the relationship of the husband and wife? Um, it's all very much applicable to what we're dealing with.
Let me mention this point. I think it's a good fair ending. And what you just said caused it to come to my mind. This is a story about the cosmic battle of good versus evil.
Mhm.
But at its heart, in other words, what can we do as people, weak people, again, in the cosmic battle of good and evil? Part of Lewis's answer, um, do what God has given you to do. Relate to the world around you in those small ways that God has given you to do it. And there's lots of ways to do that. We've talked about some of
Yeah.
them, but at its heart, this is it's kind of a book about a marriage.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very much
It's kind of a
what
book
we do.
about a marriage.
Yeah.
What role do you play in the cosmic battle of good and evil? It's as small as being the man or the woman that you need to be in your life, perhaps in the context of marriage, if God has called you to marriage. Be a better husband, be a better wife. It starts with something as simple as that.
Yeah, I would say simple and attainable rather than small, because what he would say is that's actually the biggest thing you do.
Small in a manner of speaking.
Yes.
Small in a manner of speaking.
It's an application of, I don't even remember which Mars Hill audio episode this was, but Ken Myers was interviewing someone and he was talking, and he's a university professor, and he said, I get a lot of young students who come to me and like, how can we fix the world? And I always tell them, you're not going to fix them. Like that's not.
In terms of what you mean.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that no one can do that. But what you can do is practice obedience to God. Study the scriptures, pray, attend church, be a good member of your community, take care of the poor in your community. Not all poor. In fact, that doesn't even scrutiny say that's not even a real thing. But you can take care of the poor person in your sphere. you can take care of the piece of land in your sphere. And when we do that, that's actually the way in which we serve God. And God will use that to do great things. He takes the mustard seed and builds a giant plant from it. So
Jesus says, just do what I told you to do and wait for my return.
yeah, yeah, that's right. He tells the apostles to go and baptize, in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Teach them all that he said. But he doesn't say, go to Rome and make sure that you get the emperor, because that's the real way to go to it. He just says, go and
Love people.
that's right.
Love people. Teach them what I taught you,
That's right.
which includes baptism and discipleship.
That's right.
And wait for my return.
That's right. And so the power's in the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, not in our abilities.
Well, if you have not read the Space Trilogy, and if you've not read That Hideous Strength, we commend it to you. If any of you want to talk with me or talk with Phillip here about that, we would love to get into a conversation with you about it. Well, thank you for the conversation, and with that, we'll call it a wrap.